The profane affair of the judge's wife and the slave didn't just destroy one marriage, it obliterated an entire empire of lies in a single, devastating blow. But beneath the silk dresses and grand plantation dinners lay a secret so dangerous, so utterly scandalous, that it would expose the rotting hypocrisy at the heart of Southern respectability. This is the story of how one moment of weakness, one forbidden connection, would topple everything the Johnsons had spent decades building, and by the end, no one in New Orleans would ever look at the family the same way again. What happened next would change everything. Margaret Johnson stood in front of her vanity mirror, pinning the final pearl into her hair with the precision of a woman who had performed this ritual 10,000 times before. The reflection staring back at her was flawless, immaculate. Everything a judge's wife in 1847 New Orleans should be. Porcelain skin, carefully arranged curls, eyes lined with just enough kohl to suggest sophistication without scandal. Her emerald dress was imported from Paris. Her jewelry was the envy of every woman in the city. She was, by every measure that mattered in her world, a triumph of feminine virtue. But Margaret knew the truth. She was a masterpiece of deception. Every morning for the past 18 years, she had woken up and constructed herself like a building being assembled brick by brick. The gracious smile, the demure posture, the way she laughed at her husband's jokes as if they were genuinely amusing instead of the tired repetitions of a man who believed his own importance. The way she managed the household staff with quiet authority. The way she sat perfectly still during endless church services. Her hands folded in her lap, her expression suggesting a woman at peace with God and her circumstances. The way she made herself small. Judge Henry Johnson was a powerful man, respected, feared even, in the corridors of power that shaped Louisiana's legal system. He had married Margaret at 22, fresh from her father's house, untouched and obedient. She had given him 3 children. She had never contradicted him in public. She had never spent money without his permission. She had never, in 18 years, given him a single reason to doubt her loyalty or her devotion. And it had slowly, methodically, destroyed her. Margaret set down her hairpin and pressed her palms against the cool wood of the vanity. Her breathing was shallow. Her heart was beating in that strange, irregular way it did more and more often these days. She was 40 years old, and she felt ancient, hollowed out, like someone had reached inside her chest and carefully removed everything that made her feel alive, leaving behind only the shell of propriety. The worst part was that no one could see it. Her children, James, who was 16, and the twins, Catherine and Margaret Jr., who were 14, saw only their mother, kind, present, unremarkable. They had no idea that their mother spent hours lying awake at night staring at the ceiling of her bedroom while their father slept beside her, wondering if this was all there would ever be. More nights, more mornings, more of the same suffocating, elegant prison. Her husband saw even less. Henry Johnson looked at his wife the way he looked at his fine furniture, as an ornament that served a function and required regular maintenance. He did not see the woman underneath. He did not see Margaret. He saw Mrs. Johnson, the role she played, the position she filled. As long as she played her part well, he was satisfied. And the rest of New Orleans society? They saw exactly what Margaret wanted them to see. A woman of impeccable breeding, perfect comportment, and quiet grace. A woman to be emulated. A woman who had everything. But Margaret knew better. She knew that respectability was a cage. She knew that virtue, when performed continuously and without relief, became a kind of torture. That the constant monitoring of every gesture, every word, every thought, the endless self-surveillance that society demanded of women like her, was a slow, elegant form of suffocation. That being seen as respectable meant being invisible. That being a good woman meant being no woman at all. Margaret had read every book she could smuggle into her room. She had studied philosophy and poetry and history. She had developed opinions about politics and literature and morality that she would never, ever voice in public. She had imagined conversations, real conversations, not the vapid social pleasantries that passed for discourse among the wives of New Orleans' elite, and had played them out in her mind so vividly that sometimes she forgot they had never actually happened. She had dreams where she was someone else entirely, dreams where she was not a wife, not a mother, not a symbol, where she could speak without calculating how her words would be received, where she could want things without shame, where she could exist in her own body, in her own life, without the constant weight of other people's expectations. But dreams were dangerous things. Margaret had learned long ago to lock them away, to treat them the same way she treated her true feelings, as things to be hidden, managed, controlled. She was very good at control. What she did not know, as she fastened her pearls and prepared to descend the grand staircase of the Johnson plantation for another evening of flawless performance, was that her carefully constructed world was about to be shattered by the arrival of someone who would see her, really see her, for the first time in 18 years. Someone who would make her feel, for the first time in nearly 2 decades, like a human being instead of a performance. Someone who would offer her exactly what she wanted most in the world, and someone whose very existence would threaten to destroy everything she had spent her entire life protecting. But everything changed the moment he arrived at the plantation. The slave auction had been Henry Johnson's idea, naturally. He had decided that the plantation needed additional labor for the spring planting, and he had gone to the market in New Orleans with the same deliberate efficiency he applied to every transaction in his life. He returned 3 days later with paperwork, supplies, and a man. Margaret first saw him from the upstairs window of the main house. He was being led across the yard by the overseer, his wrists bound with rope, his dark skin glistening in the afternoon heat. He moved with a strange kind of grace, not the broken, defeated shuffle of so many enslaved people Margaret had seen throughout her life, but something else entirely. There was a quality to his bearing, even in chains, that suggested he had not yet fully surrendered to his circumstances. He couldn't have been more than 30. Margaret watched from behind the curtain, her hand pressed against the glass, and felt something shift inside her chest. It was a small thing, a flutter, a quickening of her pulse. She told herself it meant nothing, that she was simply curious, the way one might be curious about any new addition to the household. A horse, a piece of furniture, a human being purchased for labor. She was lying to herself, and some part of her knew it. Over the next week, Margaret found reasons to be in the areas where he worked. The gardens, the kitchen courtyard, the storage rooms. She told herself she was simply managing the household, checking on supplies, ensuring that tasks were being completed properly. These were all reasonable explanations for the careful, deliberate routes she took through the plantation. His name was Samuel. She learned it by overhearing the overseer bark it during the day. Samuel. It was a biblical name, which seemed fitting somehow. Appropriate. The kind of name that would not raise any eyebrows if she happened to speak it aloud in conversation. She never did, but she said it to herself, alone in her room at night. Samuel. The word felt dangerous in her mouth, forbidden, thrilling in a way that made her feel guilty and ashamed and more alive than she had felt in years. Samuel was intelligent. That much became apparent within days. He learned tasks quickly. He asked thoughtful questions about how things should be done. He spoke with an educated accent, which was unusual for someone in his position. Margaret found herself wondering about his history. Where had he come from? How had he ended up at an auction block in New Orleans? What had his life been before? These were dangerous questions. Questions she had no business asking. Questions that might humanize him in ways that were fundamentally threatening to the entire structure of the world she lived in. And yet she could not stop asking them. It was during the second week that they had their first real conversation. Margaret had gone to the library, her sanctuary, the one place in the house where she was truly alone, to retrieve a book that had fallen behind the shelf. She was on her hands and knees, reaching into the narrow space when a shadow fell across the floor. "You need assistance, ma'am." She turned so quickly that she struck her head on the shelf. When she emerged, flustered and mortified, Samuel was standing there with his hands carefully visible, his expression neutral. He was holding the book she had been searching for. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Margaret became acutely aware of her appearance. Her hair slightly disheveled, her dress wrinkled from kneeling, her face flushed. She was not performing. She was not Mrs. Johnson, the perfect judge's wife. She was simply Margaret, a woman on her knees in a library looking at a man with an intensity that would have scandalized everyone she knew. "Thank you," she said quietly. "It was under the settee, ma'am. I saw it when I was cleaning." His voice was careful, measured. He was being deliberately formal, maintaining the appropriate distance between a white woman and an enslaved man. He was protecting both of them, really, though only she understood that he knew what he was protecting her from. "What is your name?" she asked. It was a ridiculous question. Of course she knew his name, but she needed him to say it. She needed to hear it in his voice. "Samuel, ma'am." "And where were you from, Samuel? Before you came here?" She was crossing lines. She knew it immediately. A respectable woman did not inquire into the personal history of enslaved people. A respectable woman maintained a careful distance, both physical and emotional. A respectable woman did not look at a man the way Margaret was looking at Samuel. "Charleston, ma'am. I worked in a merchant's house." "Were you happy there?" The question hung in the air between them like something living and dangerous. Samuel's eyes met hers for just a moment, long enough for her to see the intelligence there, the complexity, the full personhood that slavery was designed to deny. Then he looked away. "Happiness is not something I have experience with, ma'am." The words landed like a blow. Margaret felt them in her stomach, in her chest, in the deep, hidden places of her being where she kept her own impossible desires and unspoken sorrows. "No," she said softly. "I suppose it isn't." She took the book from his hands, careful not to touch his fingers. Their eyes met one more time, and in that brief moment of connection, something shifted. Some fundamental understanding passed between them. A recognition. A terrible, beautiful acknowledgement of what they were both feeling. After he left, Margaret sat in the library for an hour without moving, the book unopened in her lap, her heart beating in that irregular, dangerous way. She told herself it meant nothing. She was lying to herself again. But the worst part was that she knew, with absolute certainty, that it would happen again. The garden had always been Margaret's refuge. It was a sprawling expanse on the eastern side of the plantation, hidden from the main house by a wall of ancient oaks and flowering shrubs. Here, among the roses and jasmine and magnolias, she had spent countless hours alone with her thoughts, pretending that the world beyond the garden's boundaries did not exist, that she was not a wife, not a mother, not a woman bound by the suffocating conventions of her time and place. It was here that she began to see Samuel deliberately. It started innocuously enough. He was assigned to maintain the gardens, a task that required him to work early in the morning and late in the afternoon, when the heat was less intense. Margaret began to take her walks at these times, always alone, always with plausible explanations if anyone asked. The light was better for reading in the garden. The air was cooler in the early morning. She needed solitude to think. All of it was true. None of it was the real reason. The real reason was Samuel. They did not speak at first. They simply existed in the same space, careful and cautious, maintaining the appropriate distance. But there was an electricity between them, a current that made the air feel charged, alive. Margaret would watch him work, the way his muscles moved beneath his shirt, the concentration on his face, the grace of his movements, and feel something dangerous blooming in her chest. She had never felt anything like it before. Her husband had never made her feel this way. Henry's touch was perfunctory, obligatory, a marital duty performed in darkness without tenderness or real desire. Margaret had long ago learned to endure these encounters without feeling, to mentally absent herself from her own body and exist instead in some distant corner of her mind where she did not have to confront the emptiness of it all. But Samuel's presence, even at a distance, even in silence, made her feel present in her own body in a way that terrified her. By the third week, the silence began to crack. "The roses are particularly beautiful this year," she said one morning, standing near the garden gate, looking deliberately away from him. "You've cultivated them well, ma'am," Samuel replied carefully. "They respond to attentive care." It was innocent, completely innocent. A comment about flowers between a woman and a man maintaining a plantation, and yet every word felt loaded with meaning. Every glance felt like touching fire. The conversations remained carefully formal. They discussed plants, the weather, the proper techniques for gardening in the Louisiana heat. Never anything personal, never anything that would cross the invisible but absolute line that separated them. And yet, with each conversation, that line seemed to grow thinner. Margaret found herself engineering more opportunities to be in the garden. She began to spend hours there, ostensibly reading or sketching, but really waiting for the moments when Samuel would appear. She started wearing her nicer dresses, the ones with the delicate lace, the ones that showed her figure to advantage. She began to pay attention to her appearance in ways she had not in years, wondering if he noticed, terrified that he did. One afternoon, nearly a month after he had arrived, she dropped her book deliberately near where he was working. He picked it up without hesitation, and when he handed it back to her, their fingers brushed. It was the first time they had touched, and the contact sent a jolt through Margaret's entire body so intense that she nearly gasped. Samuel's hand withdrew immediately, but not before she saw the way his jaw tightened, the way his breathing changed. He felt it too. "Thank you," she whispered. "Of course, ma'am." But his eyes betrayed him. In that moment, before he could compose himself, Margaret saw the truth. He was not indifferent to her. He was not simply maintaining the respectful distance required of his position. He was fighting against something just as she was, fighting against it. The pull between them was mutual, dangerous, impossible, and absolutely undeniable. That night, Margaret lay awake in her bed while Henry slept beside her, and she made a decision that would change everything. She was going to cross the line. She did not know how. She did not know when. But she knew with absolute certainty that she could not continue living in this liminal space, existing in proximity to Samuel without acknowledging what was happening between them. She had spent 40 years being careful, 40 years being respectable, 40 years denying herself the very thing she wanted most, to feel alive, to be seen, to connect with another human being in a way that was real and true and utterly, devastatingly authentic. If she was going to lose everything, and she was beginning to understand that she would lose everything, then it would be for something that mattered, something that made her feel like herself. Even if that self was a profane, immoral, scandalous woman who violated every rule of her society and her station. 2 nights later, she left her bedroom after Henry had fallen into his usual heavy sleep. She wore a dark dress and no jewelry. She moved through the house with the silence of someone who had spent years moving through it unnoticed. She slipped out through the side door and into the darkness of the Louisiana night. The slave quarters were on the far side of the plantation, past the gardens, hidden in a cluster of live oaks. Her heart was pounding so violently she thought it might burst from her chest. This was madness. This was the ultimate transgression. If she was caught, if anyone discovered what she was about to do, it would not simply be scandal. It would be social death, legal consequences, her marriage destroyed, her children ashamed and shunned, her entire world collapsing in on itself. She was terrified. She was also more alive than she had ever been. Samuel was standing outside his quarters when she arrived, as if he had been waiting for her, as if he had always known she would come. Their eyes met in the darkness, and Margaret saw her own desperate hunger reflected back at her. "You shouldn't be here, ma'am," he said quietly. "I know," she replied. "If anyone sees—" "I know." She stepped closer to him, closing the distance that had always separated them. She could feel the heat radiating from his body. She could smell him, sweat and earth and something uniquely, intoxicatingly him. "I don't care," she whispered. "I don't care anymore." When he reached for her, when his hands touched her face with a gentleness that made her want to weep, Margaret understood that she had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. She had become someone else, someone dangerous, someone profane, someone, finally, devastatingly, herself. But even in that moment of absolute freedom, Margaret did not understand the price she would have to pay for it. Margaret became a woman divided. By day, she was Mrs. Judge Henry Johnson, the perfect wife, the devoted mother, the paragon of Southern respectability. She presided over dinner tables with grace. She managed the household with impeccable attention to detail. She attended church services and charity functions and social gatherings, smiling the correct smile, saying the correct words, performing the role she had perfected over 18 years with such precision that no one, not even her closest friends, suspected anything was amiss. By night, she was someone entirely different. The affair with Samuel developed in the shadows and the stolen hours, carefully choreographed to avoid detection. Margaret learned the rhythms of the plantation, the patterns of the household staff, the moments when Henry was absorbed in his legal work and the children were occupied with their own activities. She discovered that there were windows of opportunity, brief, precious windows, when she could disappear into the darkness without raising suspicion. She went to him in the gardens when the moon was new and the shadows were deepest. She waited until the house was asleep and slipped out through the side entrance. She developed elaborate excuses for her absences, headaches that required solitude, insomnia that drove her to walk, a newfound passion for early morning sketching in the garden before the heat became unbearable. Her family accepted these explanations without question. Why would they not? Margaret had spent 18 years earning the right to be trusted implicitly. Her reputation for virtue was so firmly established that the idea of her doing anything improper was genuinely inconceivable to those around her. This was both her greatest advantage and her most terrible vulnerability. With Samuel, Margaret experienced a version of intimacy she had never known existed. It was not simply physical, though there was passion between them. A desperate, hungry passion that left her breathless and shaking. It was also emotional in ways that terrified her. They talked for hours in the darkness, hidden in the garden or in the small room where Samuel slept, speaking in low voices about everything that mattered. Samuel told her about his life in Charleston, about the merchant's household where he had worked, where he had learned to read by secretly studying the books in the library at night, about his dreams of freedom, about the constant, crushing weight of existing in a world that denied his humanity, about the rage that lived inside him, carefully controlled, because expressing it would mean death. Margaret told him about her life, the suffocation of respectability, the way her identity had been systematically erased by marriage and motherhood and social expectation. She told him about the books she read in secret, the thoughts she could never voice, the version of herself that existed only in her mind. She told him about the hollowness at the center of her marriage, the way she had learned to absent herself from her own body, the terror and exhilaration of finally feeling something real. "This is dangerous," Samuel said to her one night, holding her close in the darkness, "for both of us, especially for you." "I know," Margaret replied, "but I don't care." And she meant it. The risk had become part of the attraction, the possibility of discovery, the potential consequences, the way that this affair represented a complete and total rejection of everything she had spent her life protecting. It all made her feel vital in a way that nothing else could. She was no longer simply performing her life. She was living it. But the double life was beginning to show cracks. Margaret found herself distracted during social gatherings, her mind wandering to Samuel, her body remembering the touch of his hands. She caught herself smiling at private jokes, thinking about conversations they had shared, feeling the ghost of his presence when she was surrounded by people. She became careless. In small ways, a hastily hidden love note, a moment of distraction that made her snap at one of her children, a tremor in her voice when Henry asked why she seemed preoccupied. More dangerously, people were beginning to notice. Her closest friend, Eleanor Beaumont, commented one afternoon during a social call that Margaret seemed distracted lately. "Is everything well with you and Henry?" she asked with the gentle probing that passed for intimacy among the women of their circle. Margaret's heart nearly stopped. She forced a laugh that sounded genuine even to her own ears. "Of course. Henry is simply occupied with a difficult case. It weighs on him, and therefore on all of us." Eleanor seemed satisfied with this explanation, but Margaret could see the questions lingering in her eyes. How long before Eleanor, or someone else, began asking more serious questions? How long before someone noticed that Margaret was spending time in the gardens late at night? How long before the enslaved people in the quarters, who certainly knew about the affair, decided to speak about it? And there was something else, something that had begun to terrify her more than the possibility of discovery. She was beginning to love Samuel, not in the passionate, physical way that had drawn her to him initially, though that remained intense and urgent, but in a deeper way, a way that involved genuine care for his well-being, genuine concern for his future, genuine investment in his happiness. She found herself thinking about what his life would be like after she was gone, and she was beginning to understand that she would be gone. This affair would end. It had to end. And when it did, Samuel would be left behind, still enslaved, still trapped in a world that saw him as less than human. This realization haunted her. One night, as they lay together in the darkness, she made a decision that would set the final sequence of events in motion. "We have to leave," she said quietly. "Both of us. We have to run away." Samuel was silent for a long moment. "Where would we go?" he asked finally. "North, Canada. Somewhere where you could be free, where we could—" "Margaret." His voice was gentle but firm. "That's impossible. You know that. The North is not as far from slavery as you think. And you would lose everything." "I know," she said. "I know I would lose everything. My husband, my children, my position, my respectability. Everything." She pressed her forehead against his chest, feeling his heartbeat beneath her cheek. "But I would gain you, and I would gain myself. For the first time in my life, I would be free." Samuel held her, but he did not agree. He could not agree. Because he understood something that Margaret was only beginning to comprehend, that freedom for a woman of her station and a man of his came at a price so catastrophic that it might not be worth paying. But Margaret had already made her choice. She just did not yet understand how. That choice would destroy not just her own life, but the lives of everyone around her. The reckoning was coming, and when it arrived, it would be far more devastating than either of them could have imagined. It began with a letter. Margaret had been careless, a mistake born of desperation and the intoxicating belief that she could maintain her double life indefinitely. She had written to Samuel, a love letter filled with declarations and plans, hidden in the lining of a book she had intended to give him. She had left it in the garden, tucked beneath a loose stone near the magnolia tree where they sometimes met, believing that the hiding place was secure, that no one would ever discover it. She never recovered it. Instead, it was found by James Johnson, Margaret's 16-year-old son, who had been exploring the gardens one afternoon ostensibly to sketch the architectural features of the garden's stone walls. He had noticed the stone was loose, had bent down to examine it out of simple curiosity, and had discovered the letter quite by accident. He had recognized his mother's handwriting immediately, the precise, elegant script that had written his name in the flyleaf of his childhood books, that had composed notes to his teachers, that had penned countless social correspondence on behalf of their household. But the words contained within that letter were nothing like anything his mother had ever written before. He had read the letter with growing horror and revulsion, the words seeming to burn themselves into his consciousness with a clarity that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "My dearest Samuel, I cannot bear this separation. Every moment away from you is agony. I am planning our escape. Soon, my love, we will be free. We will leave this place, leave this life, and begin anew where no one knows us, where no one can judge us. I love you with every fiber of my being. You are the only real thing in my life. I am yours, completely and utterly, forever. Nothing. Not respectability, not my children, not my marriage, not my position in society. Nothing matters compared to the possibility of being with you. I am ready to sacrifice everything." "Are you?" James had stood in the garden, holding the letter in trembling hands, the afternoon sun filtering through the leaves of the magnolia tree in dappled patterns that seemed obscene in their beauty. The world around him had continued on. Birds singing, insects buzzing, the distant sound of servants working in other parts of the grounds. But for James, everything had stopped. Everything had changed. His mother, his respectable, perfect mother, the woman he had admired and emulated his entire life, the woman who had taught him about duty and propriety and the importance of maintaining one's position in society, a woman having an affair with an enslaved man, planning to run away, speaking of love as if such a thing could possibly be acceptable, possible, moral. The shame had been suffocating. It had wrapped around his chest like a physical thing, making it difficult to breathe. He had thought of his classmates, his friends, the entire society that had welcomed him because he was the son of Judge Henry Johnson and Margaret Johnson. What would they think when they learned the truth? What would they say about his family? How would he ever be able to show his face in public again? He had read the letter 3 times, hoping that somehow the words would change meaning, that he would discover he had misunderstood, that there was some innocent explanation for his mother's passionate declarations and talk of escape. But the meaning remained inescapably clear. His mother was not simply engaging in a momentary lapse of judgment. She was actively planning to abandon her family, her position, her entire life for a man who was enslaved, a man who, according to the laws and customs of their society, was legally considered property. He had not confronted her immediately. Instead, he had hidden the letter in his room and watched his mother with new eyes over the next several days, seeing the signs he had somehow missed before, the way she would disappear at night, claiming she needed air to ease her insomnia, the way she seemed distracted during family dinners, her mind clearly elsewhere, the way her eyes would become distant and dreamy when she thought no one was watching her, the way her hand would sometimes move to her throat or her chest, as if she were remembering the touch of someone else's fingers. He had noticed, too, the way she looked at Samuel when she encountered him on the grounds, a look of such naked desire and tenderness that it made James feel physically ill. He had noticed the careful way Samuel avoided her gaze, the way he maintained a respectful distance, and had understood, with a clarity that made his stomach turn, that his mother had somehow convinced an enslaved man to participate in her delusions of romance and escape. For 3 days, James had struggled with what to do. Part of him wanted to confront his mother directly, to demand an explanation, to give her an opportunity to explain herself, but another part of him, the part that was his father's son, the part that had been shaped by years of Southern gentility and rigid codes of honor, knew that this was not his place. This was a matter between his parents. This was something that his father needed to know. It had taken him 3 days to gather the courage to tell his father. He had requested a private audience with Henry Johnson in the study, speaking in low tones so that the servants would not overhear. He had presented the letter with trembling hands, watching his father's face transform from curiosity to confusion to absolute, incandescent rage. Henry Johnson's reaction had been volcanic and immediate. He had summoned Margaret to his study on a Tuesday afternoon, after the servants had been sent to other parts of the house. He had locked the door with a deliberateness that suggested he understood the gravity of what was about to transpire. He had confronted her with the letter, his face purple with rage, his hands shaking so violently that he could barely hold the paper. Margaret had not bothered to deny it. There seemed no point. The evidence was irrefutable. Her handwriting, her words, her heart laid bare for her husband to see in the most intimate and damning way possible. She had stood before him with her head held high, refusing to grovel or apologize or beg for forgiveness, and in that moment Henry had understood that his wife had fundamentally transformed into someone he did not recognize. "I love him," she had said simply, her voice steady and calm. The statement hung in the air between them like a weapon. Henry had struck her across the face so hard that she had tasted blood. She had felt her lip split, felt the sharp pain radiate through her cheekbone and jaw, and had not flinched. She had stood there, blood trickling down her chin, and had looked at her husband with something approaching pity. "This changes nothing," she had said quietly. "You can beat me, you can confine me, you can destroy Samuel, but you cannot make me stop loving him. You cannot make me take back what I have said, and you cannot unmake the choice I have already made." The scandal had erupted like a fever breaking, spreading through New Orleans society with the speed and virulence of a plague. Henry Johnson had not simply cast his wife aside in quiet shame, as some men might have done. Instead, he had weaponized her transgression, using it as a tool to simultaneously punish Margaret and reinforce his own position as a man of honor and moral rectitude. He had filed for a separation citing adultery in the most explicit terms. He had spread rumors throughout the city, rumors that quickly became established fact in the eyes of high society, that his wife had been carrying on an illicit affair with one of the plantation's enslaved workers, that she had planned to abandon her family and her position for a Negro lover, that she had completely and utterly surrendered her virtue to her basest instincts. He had ensured that every drawing room in the city was buzzing with the story within days. He had orchestrated the narrative with the precision of a man who understood power and social dynamics on a profound level. He had positioned himself as the betrayed husband, the man whose trust had been violated by the woman who had sworn sacred vows to him. He had positioned Margaret as a fallen woman, a creature of uncontrolled passion and moral degeneracy. And most importantly, he had positioned himself as the victor in this narrative. The man who had discovered the truth, the man who had taken swift and decisive action, the man whose wife's sins reflected not on his character, but only on hers. Margaret Johnson became the most reviled woman in New Orleans almost overnight. Society, which had celebrated her just weeks before, inviting her to teas and soirees, soliciting her opinion on matters of taste and propriety, holding her up as a model of feminine virtue, turned on her with the viciousness of a jilted lover. Women who had called her friend refused to acknowledge her on the street. When she attempted to take her usual walks through the city, people would cross to the other side of the street to avoid her. Former acquaintances would turn their backs deliberately, making a point of showing their disgust. Invitations were rescinded. The charity committees on which she had served voted to remove her name from their rolls. A planned garden party that she was to have hosted was canceled, and the invitations that had already been sent were marked with a line through her name and the initials W.D., withdrawn, disgrace. Doors that had always been open, the homes of the city's most prominent families, were slammed shut. Servants were instructed not to admit her. Merchants she had patronized for years suddenly refused her business. A dressmaker from whom she had ordered gowns returned a half-finished dress with a note stating that she could no longer in good conscience complete work for someone of such questionable moral character. She became a cautionary tale, an example of what could happen when a woman allowed herself to be corrupted by inappropriate feelings. Mothers pointed to her as a warning to their daughters. Preachers cited her case from pulpits, using her fall from grace as a sermon on the dangers of unbridled passion and the weakness of the feminine nature. The newspapers, which had once covered her charitable works and her husband's legal victories with pride, now ran stories about the judge's wife's scandalous affair, printing innuendo and speculation with barely concealed glee. The hypocrisy was staggering. The men of New Orleans, including Margaret's own husband, maintained harems of enslaved women with whom they produced children who existed in legal limbo, neither fully enslaved nor free. They used their power and position to coerce sexual compliance from women who had no legal recourse, no ability to refuse. They fathered children with enslaved women and then sold those children away to other plantations, severing family bonds for profit. They maintained these arrangements with the full knowledge and tacit acceptance of their white wives, who were expected to turn a blind eye to their husbands' sexual appetites. And yet, when a woman of Margaret's station expressed desire for a man of her choosing, when she claimed agency over her own body and her own heart, when she made it clear that this was not a casual dalliance but a genuine, transformative love, she was condemned as profane and immoral. The double standard was so absolute, so deeply embedded in the structure of their society, that virtually no one seemed to notice the fundamental injustice of it. But Margaret had noticed. Margaret had always noticed. The rules, it seemed, applied only to women. Only to women like her. Women who had the audacity to want something more than what had been prescribed for them. Women who had the temerity to fall in love with the wrong person. Women who dared to challenge the carefully constructed hierarchies of power that kept society functioning in its present form. Her children had been the most difficult to bear. James had looked at her with such disgust that she could barely stand to be in the same room with him. He had taken to spending long hours away from the house, and when he was present, he had adopted a coldness toward her that was almost worse than open hostility. She had tried to speak with him, to explain, to help him understand that love was more complicated than the simple moral categories he had been taught, but he had refused to listen. To James, his mother had committed an unforgivable transgression, and no explanation would change that. The twins, Margaret's younger, children, only 13, had wept, confused and ashamed, unable to understand how their mother could have done something so horrible. They had been removed from school in the aftermath of the scandal, their classmates having been instructed by their parents to have nothing to do with them. Margaret had discovered them crying in their rooms, trying to understand why their mother, the woman they had loved and admired, had betrayed them in such a devastating way. She had tried to explain that her actions had nothing to do with her love for them, that her need for personal fulfillment and authentic connection did not diminish her care for her children. But they were too young to understand such distinctions. They knew only that their world had been shattered, that they had become objects of pity and scorn at school, that they had been effectively exiled from society because of their mother's sins. The family had been withdrawn from all social functions. The invitations had dried up. No, respectable family would allow their children to associate with the Johnson children. No respectable household would welcome them for visits. The children had become pariahs, their futures potentially ruined because of the choices their mother had made. Henry had threatened to have her committed to an asylum, a threat that was entirely credible and terrifyingly common for women deemed unsuitable by their husbands. There were institutions throughout the country dedicated to the confinement of women who exhibited what was termed moral insanity. Women who expressed inappropriate desires, women who challenged their husband's authority, women who simply became inconvenient. Henry had made inquiries about the facilities, had spoken with physicians about her condition, had begun the process of documenting her behavior as evidence of mental illness. In the eyes of the law, Margaret had no rights. Everything she owned belonged to her husband. Her person belonged to her husband. Even her body, legally speaking, belonged to her husband. She had no recourse, no protection, no way to prevent him from having her committed if he chose to do so. The threat hung over her constantly, a reminder that she existed entirely at his pleasure. He had also threatened to take her children from her permanently, to ensure she never saw them again. He had consulted with lawyers about his rights as a father, and had been assured that he had every legal right to deny her access to her own children. In the eyes of the law, the children were his property, just as Margaret herself was his property. They could be taken from her at any time, for any reason. He had threatened to leave her with nothing, utterly destitute and dependent on the charity of family members who were themselves disgusted by her behavior. He had begun the process of transferring assets out of her reach, arranging his finances so that if they were to separate, she would be left with barely enough to survive. As a woman, she could not inherit property, could not conduct business, could not work in any respectable profession. Without a husband or a family willing to support her, she would have no choice but to sink into poverty and social obscurity. And through it all, Samuel had been whipped. Margaret had learned about it from one of the house servants, a woman named Celia who had taken pity on her and risked her own safety to bring her the news. Samuel had been taken to the overseer's house on the far side of the plantation and had received 20 lashes across his back for the crime of allowing a white woman to seduce him. As if he had had a choice in the matter. As if the power dynamics of their situation had not been entirely weighted in Margaret's favor. As if a man in his position, enslaved, powerless, utterly vulnerable, could possibly refuse a woman of hers without risking his own safety and survival. The injustice of it had nearly driven Margaret mad. Samuel had not seduced her. If anything, she had seduced him, had used her power and her privilege and her access to manipulate him into an affair that could only end in his destruction. She had been the aggressor. She had taken the risk. She had made the choice. And yet, in the eyes of the law and society, Samuel was the one held responsible. Samuel was the one punished. Margaret had learned that Samuel had been moved to a different part of the plantation, confined to a separate set of quarters where she could not reach him. She had learned that Henry had begun the process of finding a buyer for him, determined to remove the source of his wife's corruption from the property entirely. She had learned that Samuel was being sold to a plantation in Mississippi, hundreds of miles away, in a region known for the particularly brutal treatment of its enslaved workers. She would never see him again. Margaret had become a prisoner in her own home. She was confined to the house, forbidden from leaving without her husband's permission. When she requested to visit her parents, who lived several miles away, Henry had refused. When she asked to attend church, Henry had informed her that her presence at social gatherings would only create further scandal and disruption. She was not permitted to receive visitors. Her correspondence was monitored. Letters she wrote were read by Henry before they were sent. Letters addressed to her were opened and read before being delivered. She was watched constantly by the household staff who had been instructed to report any suspicious behavior. Every movement she made was observed and documented. If she lingered too long in any room, someone would notice. If she attempted to write a letter, it would be discovered. If she tried to leave the house, she would be stopped. More than that, she was utterly, completely alone. The woman she had been, the respectable Mrs. Johnson, the perfect wife, the pillar of virtue, had been destroyed. She had been picked apart, examined, and discarded. Every kind word she had ever spoken, every charitable act she had ever performed, every moment she had ever spent cultivating her reputation had been erased. None of it mattered anymore. None of it had ever mattered. And the woman she had become, the passionate, alive, authentic Margaret, had no place in the world. This version of herself, the Margaret who loved deeply and fearlessly, who was willing to sacrifice everything for connection and authenticity, could not exist in a society that had no room for her. The world would not accept her. The world would destroy her for daring to be who she really was. She had gained love and lost everything else. She had experienced a moment of true passion, true connection, true authenticity, and the price for that moment was obliteration. And Samuel, whom she loved more than her own life, was being sold away like a piece of furniture. She imagined him on a ship, traveling south toward Mississippi, knowing that she had caused his suffering. She imagined him in the fields of a brutal plantation, bearing the marks of the whip on his back, and knowing that it was because of her transgression, because of her love for him. The guilt was almost as unbearable as the loss. She had destroyed him. In trying to save herself, in trying to claim her authentic self, she had destroyed the man she loved. In the quiet of her room, confined, watched, broken, Margaret made a decision that would set the final sequence of events in motion. She understood now that there was no escape, no possibility of a future, no hope of redemption. She had crossed a line from which there was no return. She had become untouchable, unmarriageable, unchaste. If she could not have love, if she could not have freedom, if she could not have her authentic self, then she would ensure that the world understood the price of her transgression. She would ensure that the hypocrisy of her world, the double standards, the lies, the systematic cruelty, dressed up as morality, would be exposed for all to see, even if it meant destroying herself in the process. What Margaret Johnson did next would shake the foundation of New Orleans society and change the course of her family's history forever. And the truth she was about to reveal would make everyone understand that her so-called profane affair was not the scandal. The scandal was what society had hidden all along. Margaret Johnson wrote the letter on a Tuesday evening, while Henry was occupied with legal documents in his study and the household had settled into the rhythms of nighttime routine. She used fine paper, the kind reserved for important correspondence, and she wrote in her most precise script, the handwriting of a woman of education and refinement, a woman of position and authority. But the words she wrote were a declaration of war. The letter was addressed to the editor of the New Orleans Daily Gazette, the city's most widely circulated newspaper. In it, Margaret did not defend herself. She did not attempt to justify her actions or beg for sympathy. Instead, she did something far more dangerous. She told the truth. She wrote about the systematic double standard that governed their society. She wrote about how men of prominence and respectability maintained enslaved mistresses with impunity, fathering children they refused to acknowledge, and selling those children away when it became convenient. She wrote about how these same men condemned women for moral failures while committing far greater transgressions themselves. She wrote about her own marriage, the loveless coupling, the way her body had been treated as a vessel for her husband's pleasure without regard for her own feelings or desires. She wrote about the way women of her class were expected to sacrifice their entire selves on the altar of respectability, to deny their own humanity in service to maintaining a façade of propriety. She wrote about Samuel, not hiding his identity, not protecting him from further scandal, but rather naming him directly. She wrote about how he had been beaten for the crime of loving her, how he was being sold away as punishment for her transgression, how the laws of their society had rendered him powerless and voiceless. Most dangerously, she wrote about the fundamental hypocrisy of a system that condemned her for claiming agency over her own body and her own heart, while simultaneously permitting men to do exactly as they pleased. The letter was a confession and an accusation. It was a statement of defiance and a cry of desperation. It was the last act of a woman who had nothing left to lose because she had already lost everything. Margaret sealed the letter and placed it in an envelope. She addressed it in her most formal hand. And then she did something that terrified her even more than the thought of discovery. She gave it to Celia, the servant who had shown her kindness, and asked her to ensure it reached the newspaper. "They will destroy you for this," Celia said quietly, holding the letter as if it might burn her. "I am already destroyed," Margaret replied. "At least this way, perhaps something will change." The letter was published 3 days later, running as the lead story in the Gazette, reprinted in other newspapers throughout the city. The reaction was immediate and explosive. The society that had reviled Margaret Johnson suddenly found itself forced to confront uncomfortable truths about itself. Women began to whisper about their own situations, the loveless marriages, the ways they had been pressured to deny their own desires, the double standards they had accepted without question. Men of prominence found themselves having to defend themselves against accusations they had never had to take seriously before. Judge Henry Johnson became the subject of intense scrutiny. Questions were asked about his own conduct, questions he had never expected to be forced to answer. His colleagues began to distance themselves from him. His political enemies seized on the scandal as an opportunity to undermine him. The Johnson family name, once synonymous with respectability and honor, became synonymous with hypocrisy and shame. But Margaret herself paid the ultimate price for her rebellion. Henry had her committed to an asylum within days of the letter's publication. He did not need to provide evidence of mental illness. A woman's public transgression was evidence enough. The physicians who examined her asked perfunctory questions and signed the commitment papers without hesitation. By the standards of their time, a woman who would write such things, who would expose her husband's affairs in a public newspaper, was by definition insane. Margaret spent the last 15 years of her life in the Baton Rouge Asylum for the Mentally Infirm, a place of darkness and despair, where women deemed unsuitable by society were locked away and forgotten. The conditions were horrific. The treatment was cruel. The staff operated with the assumption that these women were beyond redemption, that their confinement was not only justified, but merciful. She never saw her children again. James had taken over the family business, had worked tirelessly to rehabilitate the Johnson name, had eventually succeeded in restoring some measure of respectability to the family, though it never quite recovered the position it had held before. He had married a woman of good family and produced children. He had become respectable in the way that his mother never could, and he had never forgiven her for the shame she had brought upon him. The twins, scarred by their childhood experience of social ostracism, had grown into adults who were deeply concerned with propriety and appearance. They had married and had children of their own, but they carried with them the trauma of having been cast out, the understanding that one woman's transgression could destroy an entire family. Henry Johnson had eventually taken a second wife, a widow of good family who asked no questions about his past. He continued his legal practice, though his reputation was permanently tarnished. He lived another 20 years after Margaret's institutionalization, dying at the age of 72. His obituary made no mention of his first wife. Samuel had disappeared into the Louisiana plantation system, sold south to Mississippi as planned. No record of what became of him survived in any document Margaret could have accessed. She spent years imagining his fate, sometimes picturing him dead, sometimes picturing him surviving and building a life, sometimes picturing him remembering her with the same mixture of love and bitterness that she felt toward the memory of him. She never knew if he had lived to see freedom, if he had escaped north, if he had survived long enough to witness the Civil War and emancipation. The not knowing was perhaps the cruelest aspect of her punishment. In the asylum, Margaret Johnson became a ghost, a woman who had been erased from society, confined to a place where she could no longer threaten the carefully constructed hierarchies of power. The woman who had dared to claim her own agency, who had dared to love across the boundaries of race and class, who had dared to expose the hypocrisy of her society, had been systematically and permanently silenced. But her letter, that single act of defiance, had created ripples that could not be completely suppressed. Women began to organize. Abolitionists cited her case as evidence of the moral bankruptcy of Southern society. The contradiction at the heart of a system that condemned Margaret Johnson for her transgression, while permitting men of her husband's standing to do far worse, became impossible to ignore. even for those who wanted to ignore it. Margaret Johnson did not live to see the Civil War or the abolition of slavery. She died in the asylum in 1862, at the age of 55, broken in body and spirit, but unbroken in her conviction that love and authenticity mattered more than respectability. Her death went largely unnoticed. A brief obituary appeared in the local paper, identifying her only as the former wife of Judge Henry Johnson, deceased in the Baton Rouge Asylum. There was no mention of her affair, no acknowledgement of the scandal that had defined her final years, no recognition of the ways she had challenged her society. But in the homes of women throughout Louisiana and beyond, in the whispered conversations of those who had read her letter, in the consciousness of those who understood the cost of respectability, Margaret Johnson was remembered. She was remembered as a woman who had chosen authenticity over propriety, who had chosen love over respectability, who had dared to expose the fundamental hypocrisy of a society that claimed virtue while perpetuating cruelty. The Johnson family never fully recovered from the scandal. In the years following Margaret's institutionalization, the family became known less for Judge Henry Johnson's legal accomplishments than for the shameful conduct of his first wife. The name Johnson, once a mark of distinction in New Orleans society, became a byword for moral corruption and hidden shame. James Johnson spent his entire adult life attempting to overcome the stigma of his mother's transgression. He became obsessively concerned with propriety and respectability, micromanaging every aspect of his appearance, his speech, his conduct. He was never able to fully escape the shadow of his mother's scandal, and he passed this anxiety down to his own children, creating a family legacy of shame and repression that would extend for generations. The twins suffered even more profoundly. Both developed significant anxiety disorders later in life. Both struggled with their ability to form healthy relationships. Both carried forward the trauma of having been ostracized as children because of their mother's transgression. One of them, Margaret's daughter, also named Margaret, became obsessively focused on maintaining her own respectability, eventually becoming a pillar of Charleston society and building a reputation for austere morality that was, in many ways, a direct reaction against the behavior of her mother. Henry Johnson's second marriage was cold and perfunctory. His second wife was aware of the scandal surrounding his first marriage, and while she did not judge him for it, indeed, the entire affair was understood by society to be Margaret's fault, not his. There was between them a distance, a lack of real connection, a marriage that was respectable but utterly devoid of warmth. As for the enslaved people on the Johnson plantation, the scandal created a strange liminal space. Margaret's letter had exposed the hypocrisy of the system that enslaved them, had made visible the ways that power was used to silence and control. But it had also resulted in increased brutality, as the enslaved were seen as sources of the family's shame and were treated accordingly. The plantation became known as a place of particular hardship, and enslaved people who had the opportunity attempted to run away rather than serve the Johnson family. When the Civil War came and enslaved people were finally freed, the Johnson plantation was among the first to be abandoned. The enslaved workers left, seeking freedom and new lives, and the plantation fell into disrepair. By the time the war ended, the Johnson family's wealth and power had been completely destroyed. Judge Henry Johnson died bitter and diminished, his power stripped away, his reputation ruined. He left behind an estate that was a fraction of what it had once been. His children inherited not wealth, but debt, not respectability, but shame. Looking back at the scandal of the Johnsons, history reveals something that the people of Margaret's time could not see. The true scandal was not Margaret Johnson's affair. The true scandal was the systematic hypocrisy of a society that condemned a woman for claiming agency over her own body while permitting men to do exactly as they pleased. The true scandal was a legal system that rendered enslaved people powerless and then punished them for being victimized by people of power. The true scandal was the way that women were expected to sacrifice their entire selves on the altar of respectability, while men were forgiven virtually anything as long as they maintained the appearance of propriety. Margaret Johnson was not profane because she fell in love. She was labeled profane because she dared to make visible the profanity that was embedded in the structure of her entire society. She was punished not for her transgression but for her refusal to be silenced about the transgressions of others. In the end, the ruin of the Johnsons was not caused by Margaret's affair. It was caused by the exposure of the hypocrisy that had always been at the heart of their respectability. It was caused by one woman's decision that authenticity mattered more than appearance, that truth mattered more than propriety, that love mattered more than social position. Margaret Johnson died in an asylum, erased from history, forgotten by nearly everyone. But the ripples created by her letter continued to spread, touching the lives of those who read it, challenging them to question the systems they had always taken for granted. In the end, the true profanity was not Margaret's love for Samuel. The true profanity was the society that had to destroy her in order to keep its dark secrets hidden, and that profanity, that fundamental hypocrisy at the heart of respectability, would eventually contribute to the destruction of everything the Johnsons had built.